Good cinematography is much more than getting an exposure. It's about carefully and creatively placing light to reinforce the story being told, and the light meter is the tool that you'll need to help you shape that light. A light meter measures the amount of light of a scene and provides a given exposure for that scene. There are two types of light meters, an incident meter and a spot meter. While you can purchase separate meters, I recommend getting one single unit, and my weapon of choice is the Sekonic L758 Cine. Before getting into the specifics of how to use a meter, let's take a look at why it's important to use a meter in the first place. With digital cameras and the many metering tools that come with them to gauge exposure, why would you even bother with a meter? Well, for me, there are four very important reasons. First of all, location scouting. When I'm out scouting a location, it's a lot easier to bring my meter along with me to take readings at that location to determine the light levels. I don't have to lug around and set up my camera. I can quickly and easily get the information I need and make my plans accordingly. Knowing what the light levels are like and determining the tools I need are important steps in the pre-production process. Secondly, it's helpful for determining light ratios and maintaining light levels. If I'm lighting a scene to a specific ratio and I want to maintain continuity throughout the shots, I need to know what each light is giving me and what the ratios are. That way, when we move in for the close-up, I can make the light more flattering to the talent while maintaining the same ratios of light. Thirdly, the meter allows me to effectively communicate with my crew. When I'm lighting a scene, it's important that I'm able to clearly communicate with my crew, from my gaffer to my first AC to the key grip. Precise communication speeds up the work on set. If there's a trouble spot, such as an overexposed portion of the frame, I need to know how much I need to bring it down, or how much I need to bring up the shadows in order to get a proper exposure. Just knowing that I am overexposed is not good enough for me. I could waste time, and I could guess at what needs to be done, and then have my crew make multiple changes. Or, I could just take a reading and know right away what needs to happen. Furthermore, if notes are taken about the lighting setup and aperture, then when pickup shots need to be done months later, I can be sure that the light levels and the exposure will match. And finally, it's much more efficient to use a meter instead of the camera to light a scene. If I'm lighting through the camera, that means I have to wait for it to be ready and for talent to be ready and available, which is not the most efficient way of working. For example, in the morning on set, while my first AC is taking care of getting the camera built and prepared for the day's work, and before talent or stand-ins have even arrived, I can be working with the gaffer and key grip to light a scene. We can start working right away. If there's a second area that also needs to be lit, I can be lighting it at the same time as well. I'm not slowed down by having to wait for the camera, nor do I have to move the camera from location to location. And as an added benefit of always using my meter, my eye gets trained to different light levels and ratios, which allows me to work even faster. As I use different lighting tools, I get familiar with what readings they will give me, and I can light by eye and make informed decisions rather than having to make a lot of changes. In short, the meter will allow you to get better results and get them faster, all the while training your eye to see light in a whole new way. And one day, you may not even need that meter. So let's get on with it, shall we? Every cinematographer seems to have their own preferred method of using a meter, and I'm going to show you my method. Take and use the bits that work for you and adapt them to your own style of working. The important thing to understand is what a meter is telling you. Anytime you take a reading, whether it's using the incident or spot meter, it is giving you an exposure reading of middle gray. If you take a reading of a white object and expose at that reading, or take a reading of a black object and expose accordingly, they'll both come out as gray, and they will both be improperly exposed. So let's take a look at how to take readings and figure out what the meter is telling us. The incident meter comes as either a sphere or a flat disk, or as with the Sekonic 758 Cine, the sphere can be retracted to act like a disk. Either way is taking a reading of all of the light falling on to a subject. When you use the incident meter, you take a reading from the subject's point of view back towards the camera. When the sphere is fully exposed, it will give you the correct exposure for the scene, taking all of the lighting into account. This is helpful for lighting objects that have depth and dimensionality to them, which is great for lighting a scene before talent is available. So if you light your scene and the meter says F4, then if you expose at T4, middle gray will be exposed properly. Using the flat disk, retracting, or shielding the sphere can be useful for a number of applications. When retracted, You can take a reading of a flat object, such as a painting or a picture, to get the proper exposure. Additionally, you can use this mode to take readings of individual lights to determine their contrast ratio. Something that I like about the 758 Cine is that you can have the meter do the maths for you, so you know the ratio is correct. To do this, first take a reading of your key light, and then press the AVE button, and next take a reading of the fill light, or whatever light you want the ratio of, and the EV difference will be displayed on the screen. The spot meter comes in handy in many applications where the incident meter is impractical, or unable to take a reading. And truth be told, if I had to choose only one meter to use, it would be the spot meter. As the name suggests, the spot meter takes a reading of a very narrow spot of the scene. Generally speaking, the spot meter is read from the point of view of the camera back into the scene. The reading that it is giving you is how much light is being reflected from a given object. Again, if you expose at this value, then middle gray will be properly exposed in your image. But that only works if you're metering a value that is at middle gray in your image. So how do you know what middle gray is? There are two ways of figuring this out. The first method is to measure a gray card in your key light. Or secondly, you can meter off of an object that should be at middle gray if you know what to look for. Some examples are a typical blue sky, slightly darker grass, slightly darker than Caucasian skin like Latins, Greeks, Indians, or Asians. However, I have found the spot meter to be most useful in controlling the scene's overall dynamic range and matching it to my recording medium. Digital imaging is a lot less forgiving than film. Once a highlight is clipped, it's gone. You cannot recover it, as the information just does not exist. So a best practice of using your meter with a digital capture device is to meter the midtones and then check the highlights. Say for example you don't have time or you cannot get to the position of the subject to take an incident reading, or you're having trouble figuring out what in your scene represents middle gray. A quick and easy way to determine the correct exposure is to spot meter Caucasian skin in the key light. Most Caucasian skin should fall in zone 6, or one stop over base exposure. If your meter reads F8, then the proper exposure is T5.6. Once you know what your midtone is, you can now check your highlights. I can use the spot meter to take readings of the highlights and know if they are within the range of my recording format. And if they're not, I know how much I need to bring them down in order to preserve any detail I want to see. For example, if I know my base exposure is at T5.6 and my recording format can handle 5 to 6 stops of overexposure, then I know I have to keep any highlight that I want detail in at an exposure of T32 or less, as at T45 it will clip and be rendered as white without detail. I can also do this with any other value in the scene. Say I want a shadowed area of my frame to be 2 stops under. I can take a reading and know how close that area is to being 2 stops under, and I can make any lighting adjustments as needed. And this brings us back to the improperly exposed plate. How do I use my meter to get a proper exposure in this situation? The first thing I need to know is what is the exposure range of the camera I am using. This example was shot using the GH2. Through previous testing, I have found that I can record up to 3 stops of overexposure with this camera. Now I'll use that information to get an accurate exposure of the plate. First up, the incident meter. For this situation, where there are no midtones present in the scene, a white plate on a black background, the incident meter is going to be my best weapon of choice. I place the meter in the same position as the plate and take a reading. I use that reading to set the exposure on my lens, and now the plate will be rendered white. For extra good measure, I can spot meter to check the highlights and see if I'm losing any detail in them. Now let's take a look at using the spot meter. The first option would be to take a reading off of the gray card in the key light, and then use that reading to set the exposure on the lens. But let's say we forget our gray card. Now what do? My recommendation would be to take a reading directly off the plate and then compensate accordingly. So if the plate reads T8 and I want to keep detail in it, and I can record 3 stops of overexposure, then I'll set my lens to T4 so that the plate is rendered white with detail. If I want it to be pure white with no detail, then I'll put my exposure at T2.8. Buy the proper tool once, and it's only going to hurt once. Spending more up front means that you only have to spend it one time, which is why I recommend getting the Sekonic 758 Cine. It's set up for cinematographers and our work on set. However, I recognize that money can be tight, especially when you're just starting out. So get your hands on any meter you can afford. The very first meter I ever got was a used analog Minolta incident meter at my local photography store for about $30. While it worked great, I had to do a lot more math and conversion in my head. If that's still too much for you, and you have a DSLR, then change the metering mode in your camera to center weight or spot mode, and then set your camera in shutter priority mode or in full manual mode, and make sure your shutter is set properly, and take your readings with that. But a word of caution, I strongly recommend against this method. The spot meter in your camera is not as accurate as an external meter, but even more importantly, even if it were as accurate, it is bad form on set to be tilting and panning the camera around the scene to take readings. You'll get the director upset and possibly get the client seasick as they watch the image on the client monitor whip around the set. Here are a couple of helpful tips for working with the 758 Cine. First off, use the ISO 2 button to create a highlight priority mode in the meter. To do this, press ISO 2 and then use the jog wheel to set your compensation value. After you take a reading of a highlight, all you have to do is press the ISO 2 button, and it will do the math for you, telling you what your exposure should be if you want to retain detail in that highlight. Secondly, change the position of the trigger button in the spot metering mode. The default setup is to have the button under the eyepiece to act as a trigger when in spot mode, but I have found it much more ergonomic to change its position to the memory button. Now when you use spot mode, you can use your trigger finger to take the reading. To do this, you have to enter the custom setting menu, number 17, and change the item number to 2, which is auto switching. And that wraps it up. You can support this content and the creation of future videos by purchasing my camera and lighting tutorials at thecinematographerseries.com or by buying my stock footage at ryanewalters.com. Until next time, get out there and shoot.